Hello and welcome. This is Karen Sullivan of Soul Symbols, and this is our Friday contemplation. I explained last Friday when I spoke about the root and the web that I intend to use Fridays as contemplation time. And on Mondays, I tend to open with the wider sky, the broad view, the larger pattern, and that archetypal weather moving through our collective field. But on Fridays, I want to come down to the ground, into our lived reality and that felt texture of a pattern. So we'll be moving on Fridays into what it might mean not only in the sky, but in our bodies, choices, work, relationships, and in the deeper architecture of life. And this week, the sky feels especially fitting for that movement. Today is the new moon in Aries, and there is such a strong Aries emphasis in that field right now. That stellium concentration of fire, initiation and forward movement, with that Mars and Saturn meeting there too. So a real sense of ignition, pressure, beginning, force, naming, movement, but also with Saturn, the structure for it. So fire is the meeting form here, and the impulse is meeting the sides of a container. So fire, impulse and action is coming into contact with form. It's meeting an edge and consequences. And when I sat with that, the language that kept rising for me was scaffolding and source. So that's what I want to open with today. And it's not a polished theory or a final answer. I want to present it as a threshold language, a way of naming something many of us feel deep down, maybe for a long time, but perhaps haven't had the words for it. There are structures that we all build under pressure, but there's also something deeper in us that remains alive beneath those structures. There are ways we learn to function, adapt, belong, survive, and also to remain legible inside systems that don't necessarily honour soul, depth, essence, or truth. And there is also the source, and it's that deeper current, the living interior, where we have soul desire. It's that part of us that doesn't disappear even when it's been pushed underground into the shadows. So when I say scaffolding as I talk, I mean the structures built in response to external pressure. And when I say source, I mean what remains true beneath that pressure. So scaffolding is really clever, and sometimes it's completely necessary. It can help us survive a season or help us to carry weight, and it can help us move within a world that rewards adaptation more quickly than authenticity. But scaffolding is not the same thing as home. And I think many people are exhausted because they've been living for a very long time from structures that have helped them survive, but were never meant to become the deepest architecture of their lives. And this feels so resonant with the Aries new moon to me, because Aries at its deepest, it's not simply about action for its own sake. It's about the first spark of life. That's the life force, the instinct to begin. It's the courage to exist from within one's own aliveness. And with Mars and Saturn conjuncting together in Aries, there's a question to be asked. What are we building from? Is it from pressure, reaction, urgency, or is it from what the world taught us would make us safe, efficient, profitable, wanted, or acceptable? Or perhaps we're building from what is actually alive. And that feels like the deeper contemplation for this Friday. And I want to come at this through two lived examples from my own life, because this isn't just conceptual for me, it's something I've watched and wrestled with for years. And so the first example is from my time working as a therapeutic counsellor. There came a point over time when I felt a growing dissonance in that work for me personally. And that's not because there's no value in therapy. There is deeply, there's deep value there. It was because I began to notice that so often the implicit goal seemed to be helping people adapt to a malfunctioning society without the resources to change the circumstances around that person. And that had a profound effect internally for me. Because what I was seeing in clients wasn't simply individual dysfunction. It wasn't that there was something wrong with them in isolation. So often what I was witnessing was a kind of cognitive dissonance between what I would call their depth desires, what felt true for them at the level of soul, essence, deep longing, inner knowing, and the expectations of the world they were trying to function within. They wanted slowness in a system of speed and depth in a culture of service. They had a longing to belong in structures shaped by extraction. And they were often looking for integrity in environments that rewarded performance. And most definitely, the majority of them were looking for tenderness in a world that often mistakes tenderness for weakness. And their search for meaning was within systems designed around measurable output, not depth of meaning. So over time, I also began to notice as I looked at this, how easily we categorize and medicalize the inner stress of that adaptation. A person is under pressure from structures that are fragmented, extractive, alienating, and often profoundly out of rhythm with what is human. And then the distress produced by living inside those structures is read primarily as an individual problem to be managed. And of course, there are times when people need real clinical care, diagnosis, containment, and support. It's not that I'm wanting to romanticize acute distress or collapse or all suffering into a spiritual frame. But I do think we need to ask better questions about what exactly we're treating in inverted commas. Because sometimes what we're calling pathology may also be an individual meaningful response to impossible conditions. So sometimes distress is not only dysfunction, it's dissonance. It's the pain of trying to remain inwardly true while outwardly adapting to structures that just don't honour depth, soul, tenderness, slowness, or meaning. And what is striking to me is not every culture interprets such experiences in the same way. In some indigenous and traditional healing contexts, an experience that a Western framework might quickly label as psychosis or breakdown may be approached very differently. It's not necessarily denied or idealized, but understood as contact with a spiritual or unseen dimension that is requiring guidance, physical care, ritual containment, and communal interpretation. So where one worldview might say this person is having a psychotic break, another may see someone who is in contact with the chaotic world of spirit and the unseen and needs support in learning how to relate to that reality, care for the body, protection, guidance, and help in discerning what is happening. And that is a difference that mattered greatly to me, because it reminds me that our categories are never, ever neutral. They arise from an external worldview. And sometimes the worldview itself is part of what needs examining. So often what I felt in the counselling room was that the suffering people carried was not just private pathology. It was often the pain of trying to live truthfully inside structures that were not designed for depth. That's a cognitive dissonance between source and scaffold. And that's between that deeper desire for meaning, belonging, slowness, integrity, tenderness, real life, and the demand, the external demand to become manageable, productive, adjusted, efficient, compliant. So it was then that I began to wonder, what if some forms of suffering are not signs the self is broken, but signs that the soul is resisting adaptation to something that is completely distorted? What if part of the pain is sacred? What if it's a signal that source hasn't died? What if the anxiety, the grief, the numbness, the confusion, restlessness, that exhaustion, what if some of that is not simply symptom, but it's messaging? And that messaging is saying something inside me doesn't fit this structure and is not meant to be reduced to this form. Something inside me is resisting becoming only what the system can use. And when I began to see it that way, the language of scaffolding started to emerge, because so much of what people had built was a kind of scaffolding. Ways of coping, presenting, of remaining functional, ways of staying in relation to a world that demands adaptation. And again, not wrong nor shameful. It's often deeply, deeply intelligent, but it's still scaffolding. It's not source. This was the point I left therapeutic counselling. The second place that I noticed this, and kind of unsurprisingly, was in a business course I've recently been on, and particularly in the marketing sections of the business courses. I found myself feeling that same dissonance again, because so much of what is taught in those spaces is how to build the right external form for a profit-driven world. So how to position, package, optimize, convert, scale, capture attention, build the right offer structure, fit the market, make yourself legible to systems that are basically shaped around product, speed, ownership, and profitability. And alongside that, I began to notice that the scaffolding of modern marketing is so often built from deeper structural mindsets of scarcity and competition. So those feelings of there's not enough to go around, someone might steal your idea. So protect the intellectual property, copyright everything. Hold your methods tightly and be careful what you reveal. So don't be sharing too much in your gatherings or collaborate too openly in case the work is stolen. These were real feelings of people. They emanate from myself as well as I'm looking and going through this course. I'm just noticing the external scaffolding. And I understand why this logic exists. It belongs to the scaffolding of that profit-orientated system built around differentiation, ownership, market capture, and that fear of loss. Obviously, I'm noticing what it does to the soul of the work as I put my work against those marketing techniques. Where the dissonance was for me is that the methods are teaching to build from defense rather than trust, and from possession, not participation. So there's a protectionism rather than a reciprocity, and fear replaces that relationship. So it moves us quietly away from collaboration, co-creation, community, away from commons, away from the slower architecture of mutuality. And I really have been feeling the tension of that, because while some of those tools have real practical usefulness, there's also a feeling that they can train us away from source. So away from the idea that value can deepen in relationship, or the possibility that ideas are not always diminished by being shared, but can sometimes become more alive through exchange. And I saw that as participants in the course exchanged ideas, beautiful, and away from the sense that what we're building might belong not only to us, but to a wider field of participation, contribution, and shared making. So it can teach us to build around what sells rather than what is sacred. What performs is more important or becomes more important than what is alive. So when we build with what isn't alive, that isn't coming from a flowing spring of aliveness, we have to put enormous reservoirs of our own energy to maintain. So it's where the image of the well is really meaningful to me, because a scaffold rises under that pressure, and that well is dug in response to source, finding that continuous flow, natural spring of energy and supply. So where that scaffold helps you stand inside a structure, the well is helping you to draw from what is essential. So scaffolding is external, provisional, and functional. And the well is descending, it gathers, holds, nourishes. So it becomes naturally a place of meeting. And what strikes me is that these two worlds, therapy and business, seem very different on the surface, but underneath, they're asking the same thing of the human being: adapt to the structure. So in therapy, it's adapting to the social world enough to function inside of it. And in business, adapting to the market enough to succeed inside of it. I haven't contemplated how I felt as a therapist for many years now. It was resurfaced in this business course. But in both cases, I'm finding myself asking what happens to source when adaptation becomes that highest good, and what happens to our soul when survival structures are mistaken for identity. And where's the depth when every structure is shaped by external demand? And perhaps coming back to that Aries new moon, perhaps this is what it's asking. What are we starting? Aries being the place of new beginnings, ignition. What are we starting? But underneath that, what is the structure of your beginning? What's underneath that impulse? And what is it that you're intuitively responding to? Because Aries can absolutely move quickly. It cuts through hesitation and ignites the wheel. And with Mars in Aries, we have the Mars, boldness, instinct, fire, movement, that desire to act. But we have a conjunction of Mars and Saturn there along with this new moon. And that brings with it that sobering question of structure, maturity, consequence, and responsibility. Saturn brings wisdom and helps you build a vessel for flow. It's not simply just no. So Mars wants that motion and immediacy and to push through, whereas Saturn is asking motion towards what will hold rather than that immediacy. And what are you building that can bear the weight of real life, where Mars wants to push through there? So in contemplative terms, it's not just a week for impulsive action. It might be a week for honest differentiation, for looking at the structures we're already standing on and asking, was this built from external pressure or fear or urgency? Or was it built from extraction? Or because the world taught me that if I wanted to survive, belong, earn, succeed, or be loved, this was the form I needed to take. And then beneath that, what in me is still alive underneath all of that lot? There's a sense of looking for what's not gone away. So that desire that keeps returning, and the grief and the truth that keeps returning. So what image, longing, ache, or symbolic thread keeps appearing in my life, even after years of adaptation? Because I think this is where our real work begins. It's not in shaming that scaffold. I want to say that very gently. Do not shame the scaffold. The scaffold may have held you through a season that required holding. So it may have helped you function where there was no other support. And it may have been how you remain coherent in environments that were completely incoherent. And it may have been how you stayed employed, relationally safe, psychologically intact, and externally legible. Scaffolding is often an intelligent response, but intelligence is not the same as essence. There comes a time when we begin to sense that the structure we built to survive is now keeping us too far from what is actually alive and deeply meaningful to us. And that is often a really tender threshold, because to step off certain forms of scaffolding can feel like complete vulnerability. It can also feel like uncertainty, grief, a sense of losing our identity. So it can feel like no longer knowing how to function in the world in the same way. Can leave a sense of void there. And perhaps this is where the Mars-Saturn conjunction can become especially meaningful for us, because Mars can sometimes want us smash the scaffolding in one dramatic act. Mars is depicted by the tower in the tarot. Mars has that impulse to smash it all down, bring the bulldozers in and clear the ground. But Saturn says no. Go carefully. Saturn will teach us to notice what is load bearing and respect what has carried weight, and to discern what is structural and what we have that's just merely habitual, and not confusing destruction with liberation. Mars is martial energy. Go shoot it down, destroy it, remove it. Okay, it can be like that. The shadow of Mars. But this is really important, especially for people who are sensitive to pattern, symbol, or soul debt, or all three. The work's not necessarily to demolish everything, to bring about that tower moment. The work may be to become conscious of what we're standing on, to see the scaffold for what it is, to bless it for what it did, and then to begin slowly and intentionally to transfer the weight away from adaptation, extraction, scarcity, competition, performance, and towards source, essence, participation, co-creation, towards presence. So away from structures built to satisfy the pressures of the external world, towards structures that can actually protect what is sacred, meaningful, living, and true. And that, to me, is where the well comes in. The well is not anti-structure, okay? It's redeemed structure. It's structure built around life, structure built around what must be protected because it's precious. So it becomes a rhythm that keeps you near your own truth, a practice that brings you back to your body. It can be a way of working that protects collaboration and community rather than only transaction. It can be a form of therapy or friendship or vocation, business, creativity that doesn't exist merely to make someone functional again, but to help them come back into right relationship with what is deepest in them. This is why I think the contemplation for this new moon is not only about new intentions in the usual sense, it's about a new architecture. What are you beginning to see about the structures in your life and the parts of your identity that were built under pressure, or the part of your work that has been shaped more by market demand than by soul integrity and authenticity? What part of your relational life has been organized around manageability rather than truth? Or the part of your inner life that has been bent towards adaptation when what it really longs for is a deeper alignment? And perhaps, quietly, where is Source already speaking? Because Source does speak. And it's often not in that loud language of the external world. So not in metrics, polished slogans and urgency. Often Source speaks through what persists. So through those reoccurring images, or that ache that won't disappear, the longing that keeps returning, or the sense that there's a truer life trying to emerge beneath the one that has been externally maintain. So sometimes Source speaks through our grief and through envy even, because envy can reveal neglected desire. It speaks through boredom, exhaustion, through the body refusing one more layer of performance, comes through dreams and through the strange recognition that even when things appear to be working, something essential within us isn't being fed. So for this contemplation, I want to offer a gentler form of Aries, not the caricature of Aries as mere force, but Aries as first truth, pulse, life, and that spark that says, I'm here. So the courage to begin again from what is alive in us rather than from what is expected. And with Saturn there, perhaps the invitation is to build in a way that can last. So not dramatic rebellion for its own sake or that impulsive tearing down, but in an honest beginning, a clear beginning, one that's willing to ask difficult questions about the structure. So what in me was built under pressure? What do I have alive, still alive beneath that? And what would it mean for me to build from there? What would it mean to let my work, relationships, offerings, my pace and values, my business and healing, the next steps to be organized not only by what the world and the external rewards, but by what the soul can actually inhabit? Because I think this is the deeper thing I've been searching for a long, long time. Many of us don't only need healing from personal pain, we need help discerning the difference between the self that adapted to pressure and the self that is held at depth. And perhaps this is part of why this language matters so much at this point in our time, because once we can name the scaffolding, we're not going to be unconsciously fused with it. And once there's that sensing of source, even faintly, we can begin to orient differently. And that's not going to be perfectly or all at once, but it's going to be truthfully. So I want to leave you with a few questions for this new moon in Aries. You might want to journal with them, walk with them, sit beside them, or just let them percolate slowly through you. Where in my life am I standing on scaffolding? What outer pressures shape that structure? And what does that scaffold help me to do? If you find that, honour it. But what has that cost me? What in me has gone underground in order to keep that structure in place? What is still alive beneath it? Where am I building from scarcity and fear of loss rather than from truth, contribution, and relationship? Where have I been encouraged to adapt to a structure that may itself be profoundly dysfunctional? And what would it mean to build one small part of my life now? One conversation, offering, rhythm, boundary, decision, not from pressure, but from source. Maybe that's enough for now. Not a total redesign or a dramatic solution. Just that beginning of seeing, of noticing what is structural and what is living, and building our discernment to tell the difference between them. And perhaps this is just a beautiful way to meet an Aries new moon, not only with the bold declarations, but with real honest beginnings that come from contact with what is true. Thank you for being here with me. As always, take what resonates gently and let the rest wait. And if this contemplation stirred something in you, you might simply carry one phrase with you through the weekend. The scaffold is not the self. source is still present. I'll be back on Monday with a broader view. Until then, be tender with what is surfacing. Be honest about the structures you're standing on and listen carefully for what is still alive at depth.